Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Reaper tutorial series. Today's episode is probably not going to be a long one, but it's one that I would consider to be very important, and it's all to do with backups. It sounds like quite a dry, boring subject, but it's something that's really important with digital audio because if you lose a drive or a file, it's gone forever. If things corrupt for some reason, it's lost. And there are ways within Reaper and outside of Reaper to keep everything in several places to make sure that if anything goes wrong, you can very quickly just bring it back as if nothing had ever happened. So let's check that out today. Now, the first thing to talk about is the most obvious type of backup, which is when you're done with your project and your audio files, take that folder that you've made and copy that to an external drive, whether it be a USB drive or something on a network, and if you can, do it twice to two separate places, because I've known external drives to give up and die over time. They kind of rust or get aged and the head seize, and that kind of thing over time will happen. And let's say that you've got two backups of something and your main computer dies. Quite often, over a span of years, you'll just go, you know what, I'm just going to get a new computer. You've still got these two backups, and at some point, one of those backups will seize. You've still got your files. So the old maxim goes, in digital, if it's not stored in triplicate, it doesn't exist at all. Try and keep that in mind. I know it costs more money to have more backup drives, but the fact that you can get 4 or 5 terabyte drives in the like $100, $120 range now means that it really shouldn't be that much of a barrier. And it's something I highly, highly recommend that you do, is have separate drives in separate places, possibly in separate buildings. Trust me, at some point, something will go wrong with your drives, whether it's a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I've had drives 5 or 10 years ago that have died on me, and I've lost stuff that was really quite personal to me, and I've suffered the consequences. In my professional career, it's never happened to me because I've been so, I don't know, paranoid is the word? Prepared. The positive side of paranoia is preparedness, and that's what I've done, and that's what has saved me several times. Aside from the old drag and drop copier folder, there are other ways to do it, and I use an alternate method now. I copy all my files to 2 separate backup drives, but I also have another solution. My main recording studio folder on this computer behind me is in a Dropbox account. It's a Dropbox Pro account, so I'm paying for it. It's not particularly expensive. It's less than the cost of an external hard drive per year, and it's a 2 terabyte space. And because the internet here is relatively fast, every time I hit record on a file or save on a project, it's already uploading. Within a couple of minutes, it's already backed up. So if the computer was to go fizz bang and we've not finished the project, which means I've not had time to take the whole project and back it up to a separate drive, or even in the middle of a day and we've not, got a whole day's work, I can rip that broken computer out, put something like a new computer or my powerful laptop in there, load up the Dropbox, and that will all be there on my separate computers. And it's all stored in the cloud, which means that there's no chance of a particular drive death getting rid of it. And I really, really have found it works for me. Added benefit, anything that I save on this computer with Dropbox in that folder, magically appears on my laptop in the Dropbox folder, which means that since I have a setup kind of like this laptop we've been using here, but a really powerful kind of version that I use for work at home or when I'm out in the field, that means that if I've got a decent internet connection to get those files downloaded quickly, then I can just carry on working as if I was still at this machine behind me, despite the fact that I'm not in this room. I can then do edits, I can do revisions, I can hit save, that will upload, and when I get back here, I'm not having to copy files and worry about file revisions, and that saves me a lot of time. Now let's move on to talking about what Reaper can do specifically to help you out, because Reaper has its own inbuilt features. So, back to our project that we've been working on over this series. It's a little bit of a mess, but it's useful for what we're doing today. So, let's say we've got our project ready, but we want to make sure we have backups. What we're going to do is we're going to go into Options and down all the way to the bottom to Preferences. And we're going to open up near the top the Project tab. So this is a very, very useful page in the settings, because this can really help you to have lots and lots of backups of your project file as you go. So from the top, it's got when creating new projects, use the following project file as a template. So when you hit new, if you so desire, you can have a pre-made template. It's something that I do quite a lot with the machine behind me. I've got a template that I've made with ready-made headphone mix routing and drum routing and all that kind of stuff. Saves me a lot of time, but that's kind of out the scope of this video. The next button, prompt to save on new project. I find that this can be quite useful to tick. It's not on by default, but what that means is that when you hit new project, it asks you, where do you want this to be saved to? Because Reaper can work if you just open it and just hit record. It'll just work, and it uses your default My Documents Reaper media folder to save stuff to. That's quite often not ideal, but it can be really good for a quick scratch pad. If we tick this button, it then asks us, where do you want this project to go? Which can be quite useful, because then you know right from the very first sample of recording where your files are going to end up, and you don't have to do things like the consolidation, and you don't have to do the whole file save, copy, new media or move media or any of that stuff. Then a little further down, we get to project saving, and that's what we really want to talk about today. So the first one, save project file references with relative path names. I tend to leave that ticked, and what that means is that when the project is saved, any files that are saved in that folder, it doesn't save the file name as C drive, this folder, this folder, this folder, this folder. It just says, in the folder we're in, it's called this. And the reason that makes a difference is that when you're done with this project, chances are you're going to copy this entire folder to somewhere else when you back it up. If you then want to open up that version, it's not going to struggle and go, I can't find the original files. It's going to go, oh, they're probably in this folder. And it'll just carry on, open them up, no problems. Now, this section is probably the most powerful section in terms of keeping backups. The tick box, when overwriting project file, rename the old project to .rpp, which is the Reaper extension, -back for backup. What that means is whenever I hit save, it doesn't just destroy the original project file. It just renames it so that we've still got that, but just in a backup naming system. So that if we ever need to go back to it, it's there. While we're hitting save, if something happens like, let's say the power cuts in the middle of saving your project. I've seen that happen before, and what that can do is that will corrupt your project file, and then your project file's unopenable and your entire project is lost. And I've seen that done usually with other programs. I've not seen it happen with Reaper, but I know that the potential is there. So it's something that I've seen that has completely destroyed days of work for me with other systems in the past. So it's something I'm very keen to not do again. Now, underneath that, there are a few tick boxes that I use. I usually, by default, keep multiple versions is off, and I tick that, because what that does is that rpp.back file that it made, it doesn't just have the previous version of the project then, it has every previous version of the project. It means that that file can get quite big over time, especially if there's a lot of things like Melodyne information or stuff like that, where the Reaper files, I don't know, 10 or 15 megabytes. When you've got 100 or 200 times that you've hit save, and I do a lot because I'm really quite on the ball about save, so that if things do crash, which they do occasionally, I've lost the absolute minimum amount of work. And so that means that that file can get quite big. I'm not worried about file sizes, because if it gets to a couple of gigabytes, that should, compared to the amount of audio I've recorded, still be relatively insignificant. But what that means is if I open up that backup file, then before it opens, Reaper then gives me a nice little list of every backup that is in that file with a time and a date, so that I can then go back. And this is something that's really helped me out a few times, where I've been working on a project with somebody, hit save quite a few times, something weird has gone on, like I've accidentally leant on a delete button or something and accidentally deleted a key piece of audio or a key performance, which is really quite embarrassing when it happens, but it happens. When you do this for 10 years or more, occasionally something stupid's going to happen. And the fact that I can then go back through all the backups to a certain time when that performance was there means that I can then copy that performance out and then put that into the latest version of the project, and any of that data, positioning, timing, effects choices, any of that was all kept. So then I can just pull that straight back into the new version, and then there was no problem at all. Happy times. If you're not too keen on having one big monolithic backup file, you can untick that and tick timestamp backup instead. And what that will do is, instead of having one file with everything in it, that will have every separate file with the date and time separate. If you'd rather do it that way, that option's there as well. There's also a button for keep undo histories. It's not something that I use, but it's something that's there as an option. If you are working on something and you like using the undo button quite a lot, what that does is that saves the history of the undo, so that next time you open the project, instead of the undo not being there anymore, it's as if you'd never closed the project in the first place, and all that undo history is there, and you can start hitting undo, and it will undo things for as far back as you have configured it to go. That can be quite useful for some people. Like I say, when I hit save, it's with the intention that what we have is what we want to keep. Below that, you can have auto-saved. And we're going to enable this. So every 15 minutes, you can set the number of minutes. When not recording or when stopped or at any time, I leave it on when not recording, because otherwise it can give you some possible kind of jerky system kind of half lockups when it's recording, and the recording time to me is kind of sacrosanct and should be left well alone. The computer should be doing nothing except recording at that time, and as soon as I hit stop, it will automatically save with the next one, which is save to timestamped file in project directory. So that now means that every 15 minutes, that's going to give me an auto save backup, timestamped, without me having to hit save, which is great, because that means that if I'm forgetting to press save because I'm in a different world, I'm trying to concentrate on 10 other things, it saves for me anyway, which means that I'm not going to lose 2 hours of work just because I forgot to hit save, which is something that's quite common and has bitten me in the past. So I always make sure that's saved now. Now, something else that you can do every 15 minutes or however number of minutes is save to a timestamped file in an additional directory. Now, this is something that can be quite powerful as well. If I wasn't saving to Dropbox, I could use this to save another version of the timestamped every 15 minutes to somewhere else. And for this purpose, I've plugged a USB stick in the back of the computer, just a 64 gig USB stick, so quite big. And if I was going to do this all the time, that would stay in there permanently. So that's now the D drive, and I've made a backups folder on there. So I'm going to choose that. And now that D drive backups folder, every 15 minutes, it's going to save an extra version of the project file over there in the backups file, which means that if for some reason the hard drive on this dies, corrupts, I at least had the project file. Now that doesn't include the project audio as well, but that's the next thing we're going to come to very soon. You can every 15 minutes have it overwrite the project file, which it does say it's not recommended, and I certainly don't recommend it either. And you can have it save the undo history as a separate file, so it's not clogging up your project file, which means that, like I was saying earlier, if you want to undo things when you're opening the project again later on, that keeps that, and it can be several hundred megabytes. So it's not something that I do. I'm not a big believer in undo once you've committed to a performance or a take or that kind of thing. For me, undo is useful, but once something's been committed to, I then hit save and pretend like undo doesn't exist. So I'm going to hit apply. And now, every 15 minutes, that's going to save my project. It's going to save the project separately on that USB stick. It's going to, every time I hit save, that's now going to make, in fact, I'll show you, that should have, if I open this file's location, there we go. So we've now got the tutorial audio project file. We've got a backup file, which is now the same size as the Reaper file. But if I change something in the project and hit save again, that's going to be twice that size. It's going to be 1.8 megabytes because it's going to have the older version of the backup and the newer version of the backup. And it's going to keep adding and adding and adding and getting bigger and bigger. But it's going to allow us to backtrack. And also there is this time-stamped version, which is a separate file, which has the date and the time attached. And that means that we've got everything covered, belt and braces, every possible version, including that one that should be, if I look on the D drive in the backups folder, there's our time-stamped backup. And every 15 minutes, another version is going to appear in there. So again, that will, at this rate of the project being a megabyte in size, mean that every 1,000 times it does that, that's a gigabyte. That's going to add up over time. But I'm okay with that because that means that every version of the project is kept separately. Now, that's the actual project file itself being saved. What about if we want to do something similar with our audio files? It's worth mentioning that if there's any MIDI in the project, we don't have to worry about the MIDI because the MIDI is saved in the project file itself. So with the project file itself being saved to several places, the MIDI is being saved, stored, looked after, and we don't have to worry about that so much. However, the audio is significantly larger and doesn't get stored in the project file, it goes alongside it in that project folder. So this is where we want to have a secondary recording path. So this is where we go to our file and project settings. Now if I open this up, it brings you up on the project settings, which we've talked about before a little bit, but what we want is the media tab at the top. So that you can have a default path to save media files to. I don't tend to use that because I like my files to be in the same folder as the project file itself, which by leaving this blank means that that is where that's going to go. As it says, leave blank for same path as project file. Now below that, I've already filled this in. So where it says secondary recording path, blank for none, I've added in that USB drive and the backups folder here. So what that means is we now have the option on each track of recording to a secondary recording path. There might be two reasons for this. Number one, you might want to have a massive project recording and one hard drive couldn't keep up with recording all of the audio. So what you could do, being clever, is have half of the tracks recording to a secondary drive so that you've got the workload spread across two. In the modern world with solid state drives, I can't see that being a problem like it used to be in the old spinning drive days, but the option is still there. So everything else here, I'm quite happy to leave as default. This is the default format for any new audio recordings, and this is set how I like it by default. Now, this D backups, I can hit save as default project settings, and that means that now every project that gets made is also going to have that backups folder for the secondary recording path. Now, by default, that's not going to do anything. What we need to do is per track, tell it to record invisible backups. So I actually made a track here called Recording Backups. Let's arm that for recording. And if I was to record with that just a little bit, that will only record to the primary audio path. If we look in this backups folder, there's nothing there in terms of WAV files. What we have to do is where that red record button is, where we armed it, right click on that, and there is an option right down the bottom, track, recording settings, input, quantize, format, etc. So we give that a click, and for some mad reason you can quantize MIDI track recording, something I'll never want to do. You can set the audio recording format if you want a track to record differently than WAV file 24-bit. Maybe you've got something like, I don't know, a scratch track that's just recording as a backup. You might want to make it like FLAC or OGG Vorbis, so it's a smaller file if it's going to run for hours, but you're never going to actually use it in a final project. It's just going to be something for you to listen back to remember what you were doing. I don't know, it's a choice. But the bit we want is right at the bottom. So it says record to audio path, primary only, or you can choose secondary only, or the one we probably want is primary plus secondary as invisible backup. So if we close this down and record a little bit, just imagine that there's some audio being recorded in here. I'm obviously not plugging anything in and making noise right now, but the point should stand. I'm recording some kind of audio. So when that's done, if I look in this, yeah, there we go. So D drive backups, that WAV file has been made there with a peaks file to accompany it, as well as that will also have been made in the main project folder. Which means that now we have a timestamped backup of the project. We have this WAV file right here, which as we go, they're going to add and add and add together, which means that in absolute worst case scenario, we're going to have some semblance of a backup of everything on a second drive without having to have done very much, apart from a little bit of initial setup. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning here is that counted for only this track. So what we'll probably want to do is enable that on all the tracks. So if I select all of these tracks and now go to right click on one of these record arms and bring up track recording settings, we can set primary, secondary as invisible backup, and then I can apply settings to, in this case, 19 selected tracks. So that's not closed the window, so I'm going to assume that that's just counted on all the other tracks. Let's just check the reverb and check its settings. Yes, so primary and secondary as invisible backup is now enabled on all of these tracks. If you're on some super important project where you're only going to get one chance to record it, but you're not sure if the computer's going to make it through the session, that's a really good option, because that means you're going to, in real time, have backups of every file. Say you're recording a drum kit, you get a real-time backup of every drum, as well as the main project. And every 15 minutes, it's going to save that timestamped file as well. So everything is backed up and backed up and backed up. And that means that if you do that and back up your files to other physical hard drives and external cloud services like Dropbox, you should be covered in every situation. And apart from actually paying for the physical hard drives or paying for something like Dropbox Pro, it's a relatively minimal cost for the price of saving you from oblivion when your data gets corrupted, because believe me, data gets corrupted far too often, and there's not a great deal you can do to restore things to perfect condition when corruption happens. You might get lucky, but chances are you won't. So please consider at least some of this. I hope you found this useful. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this. If you found it useful, consider supporting us on Patreon. If you give us $1 a month, that kind of thing, that really helps us to do more of these kind of videos. And if you've got any requests for videos like this, then feel free to give us a shout. If you put something in the comments section below the video, then there's a good chance we'll do a video based on your question if it's not already been covered. I'm Adam Steele for Hot Pole Studios, and we'll see you in the next episode of the series. Thanks for watching. See you later. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos, as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.